Captain and Tenille was a popular music duo made up of a husband and wife, and the duo was active until just before their divorce in 2014. They rose to prominence in the mid-70s. The husband and wife were Daryl Dragon and Toni Tenille, and they married in 1975. Daryl died not long after the divorce, though the performers held no ill will towards one another. In fact, Toni was there alongside her ex-husband during his final days. Join Factsverse as we explore how fans can't believe what happened to Captain and Tenille. Captain and Tenille performed together for decades. When Daryl Dragon passed away in early 2019, fans of the popular music duo Captain and Tenille were devastated. Daryl had been one half of the duo until 2013, the other half was Toni Tenille. They got married in 1975 and remained so until 2014. It was the preparations for their divorce that caused the duo to split. The hope of Captain and Tenille getting back together died for good in 2019, but the duo hadn't been active for several years at that point. Daryl Dragon rose to prominence as Captain Keyboard long before the duo of Captain and Tenille was formed. He was originally the keyboardist for the Beach Boys. Though Daryl was never considered one of the group's main members, he could be seen performing with the popular group during live performances between 1967 and 72. The first time Daryl and Toni met was in 1972. Toni had written music for a Broadway play called Mother Earth, and Daryl Dragon was hired on to work as a pianist. The music wasn't very memorable, but it did lead to the creation of a memorable pop duo. Daryl and Toni became good friends over the course of the Broadway run and didn't want their friendship to end when the play did. Daryl talked the Beach Boys into letting Toni join him as a touring member. How Captain and Tenille was formed. 1972 was the year Daryl Dragon stopped being a touring member of the Beach Boys, so Toni Tenille didn't get to perform alongside the group for very long. It was during this time that Daryl came up with the idea of Captain and Tenille. He grew to realize he had more in common musically with Toni than he did with the members of the Beach Boys. Before long, he talked Toni into starting a group of their own, and the rest is history. Some may wonder how Daryl ended up deciding on the stage name of Captain Keyboard. As one might imagine, it was on account of his keyboarding skills. But there are varying accounts as to who specifically coined that name. Daryl said he came up with the name himself, but some have claimed that Mike Love was the one who coined his more popular moniker. Another thing Daryl claimed was that he was asked to become an official member of the Beach Boys once he broke the news that he and Toni were forming their own band. According to Daryl, he came up with the stage name of Captain Keyboard during a performance of the song Help Me Rhonda. Daryl thought up the idea of asking Mike Love to introduce him as Captain Keyboard before a big solo, which Mike did. The fact that Mike was the first one to utter the name is probably the reason creation of it is often attributed to him. The story also goes that Daryl introduced a more liberal performance style to the Beach Boys' live shows. Before the peak years of Daryl's involvement, the Beach Boys rarely ever moved around on stage. Daryl inspired many members of the group, including Mike Love, to loosen up during concerts. Before officially leaving the Beach Boys, Daryl and Toni began performing as Captain and Tenille. Daryl officially broke the news of his resignation once he and Toni had built up enough confidence as a duo. According to Daryl, the Beach Boys offered him a significant sum of money to stick around, but the keyboardist turned it down, claiming he'd rather perform as a duo with Toni for next to nothing than continue performing with the Beach Boys.
Let's talk about the sponsor for today's video, Aura. Aura is an all-in-one solution to protect you from identity theft online. It includes identity theft protection, fraud monitoring, a VPN, password management, and antivirus software, all wrapped up into one easy-to-use app. If you're not using every single one of these tools to protect yourself, you're going to have a weak spot. It's like making sure your front door is locked, but leaving your back door wide open for intruders. Aura continuously monitors the dark web for any of your personal information, and they'll send you an alert the moment they find anything. I was shocked to find out that several of my login credentials were found on the dark web, and I wouldn't have known this without Aura. If you're active online, it's nearly impossible to protect all of your personal information unless you're using a tool like Aura. This is exactly why there are so many victims of cybercrime and identity theft. In fact, identity theft is so common, there's a new victim every 14 seconds. That means at least 3 people have had their identity stolen since I started talking about Aura in this video. So if you want to protect yourself and your family from identity theft, go to aura.com/factsverse. By visiting this URL or clicking the link in the description, you can get a 14-day free trial of Aura and and start getting protection today.
Dennis Wilson was jealous of Toni Tenille. Most members of the Beach Boys took Daryl's departure in stride, but there was one member who was pretty sour about it. According to Daryl, he and Dennis Wilson had talked sporadically about forming their own musical project before the concept of Captain and Tenille had become a thing. Daryl alleged this musical project never came to fruition on account of Dennis's substance abuse issues and lack of accountability. When Dennis caught wind of the fact that Daryl was now forming a duo with Toni Tenille and he wasn't invited, he apparently got pretty upset. In Captain and Tenille, Toni was the main vocalist, while Daryl provided musical accompaniment. The duo was a huge success. Though they formed in 1972, it wasn't until '75 that they became a legitimate sensation. This transformation occurred thanks to the release of the monumentally successful single Love Will Keep Us Together. It wasn't written by Daryl and Toni, but the anthem perfectly embodied the love the two performers felt for one another. They tied the knot the same year of the song's release. Songwriters Neil Sedaka and Howard Greenfield had written Love Will Keep Us Together in 1973, and Neil first recorded it. The version performed by Captain and Tenille was a much bigger success than the original, and is much more ubiquitous in popular culture. Love Will Keep Us Together was a massive hit. Captain and Tenille's performance of the song topped the charts, and it even went on to win the duo a Grammy Award. They had many other successful songs, including 1976's Muskrat Love. They continued performing together until 2013, and even renewed their marital vows in 1995 at their 20th anniversary. According to Toni, the divorce was a long time coming, though. It seems Daryl and Toni's marriage had suffered from a lack of intimacy for a long time. Toni claims she had tried her best to bridge the gap between she and her husband, but the issue persisted. Toni left Daryl in 2013, causing the dissolution of Captain and Tenille. Their divorce was finalized in 2014. Daryl didn't blame Toni for leaving him, and the two stayed close. When Daryl began feeling ill, Toni was there to comfort him. In fact, Toni was required to be by Daryl's side during his final days, and she still had power of attorney over her former husband. After the divorce, Toni had spent several years writing her autobiography. After those years were over, she was joyous for the chance to return to her former husband's side, even if the occasion was that he was slowly passing away. He passed away from renal failure and was deathly ill for many months before his death. Toni was by his side for several of those months and has claimed that she helped her late ex-husband out quite a deal. According to her, Daryl was in relatively dire straits before she came back into his life. The nurses apparently weren't tending to his needs as much as they could be, which prompted Toni to check him into a nicer facility. She then continued visiting Daryl regularly. Love couldn't keep them together. Toni has claimed the final words she spoke to her former husband were that she loved him. Even though the two had separated years prior, Daryl and Toni still felt an immense amount of love for each other over the years. When Daryl was finally gone, the burden laid upon Toni to disperse his ashes in the way he requested. His ashes were scattered around the wilderness area of Granite Mountain in Prescott, Arizona. They were married for several decades but never had children. Toni has claimed Daryl had intimacy issues, but she's also clarified that this doesn't mean the two didn't have sex. Love may have kept Daryl and Toni together for a long time, but it couldn't do it forever. Now it's time to hear from you. What's your favorite Captain and Tenille song? Let us know in the comments section below.